Well, the nice thing about this is you can't see the screen from here. Does this work, or do I need it, or what's going on? Yeah. I'm sitting in my office, probably 3 weeks ago, and the phone rings. Now, that's a fairly rare event, the phone ringing. They don't ring anymore. I pick it up, and who's on the phone? Teddy Dickerson. Well, we exchange a few amenities, and then she says, I can't get anybody for the first seminar. Would you be willing to talk? Well, I said, what the hell am I going to talk about? You'll think of something. And then she says, well, what about the center CV? I said, well, that'll be like watching paint dry. What the hell? I'm telling you, you got to be crazy. Pardon me? You got to be crazy to do that. Well, being a nice guy, easygoing guy, soft-spoken guy, I said, well, of course, Teddy, I'd be delighted to do it. So here I am. Now, hang on to your seats, because this is scintillating stuff. Let me start with a little bit of background. It's 25 years of trials in the Center for Clinical Trials. Now, Teddy referred to the fact that I go back before there was electricity, so I did trials before that. But, over the years, there's been a fairly dramatic shift, it seems to me, in the way we initiate trials. In the old days, the primary mode of initiation of trials was investigator-initiated. Some investigator or set of investigators has some idea, and they go to funding agencies and get it funded. Well, that changed fairly dramatically in in my lifetime, to mostly now sponsor-initiated. You can still do investigator-initiated trials, but you better be prepared to work your buns off. The last investigator-initiated trial I did was the Alzheimer's prevention trial. It took us 3 years to get it funded, and then, more after that. But, so what's the difference between an RFA and an RFP? Anybody know? Well, just one letter difference, right? A and P. Well, request for application or request for proposal. And the main difference, or one of the differences, is that if it's issued by the NIH and it's an RFA, you'll eventually, if you're lucky, you'll be funded by grants. If it's an RFP, you'll be funded by contract. So what the hell, who cares? Money's money. Well, not necessarily so. There's in general, there's more freedom, quote unquote, with the A than the P, because basically with P, you're a contractor for the sponsor. And certainly that's true with regard to industry support. You can try to initiate an industry-supported trial, but most of those are going to be coming from the sponsor. So, and I don't think that this trend is necessarily good for our nation's health. You dry up the investigator initiative and you cede it to the sponsors, well, it changes the nature and direction of what gets done. So I don't know that I'm happy about that trend, but it is the case. Also, in the old days, I would boast that my batting average, not much to boast about, by the way, my batting average was 1 in 5. Well, if I was in the major leagues and batting just 200, I'd be sitting on the bench. But 1 in 5, meaning you write 5, you get 1. But then I would say, well, but I've got a good slugging percentage. If you're into baseball, then you would know that, well, if you get funded, It's a big one. So that was the good news. Well, now, I think I haven't kept track of our batting average in the center, but I'm pretty damn sure it's not 1 in 5. It's probably closer to 1 in 10. That either means we've gotten worse at this or it's gotten tougher to do, and its funding is difficult. And I've lived through 2 or 3 of these phases, so I keep saying, well, it'll change again. I don't know when it'll change. There's a seat up here. You people standing just make me really nervous because, and there's some chairs there. Yeah, take some chairs. Anyway, what was I saying? Well, okay. Anyway, that's a bit of background. Now, so let's see what we got here. Well, I hear bells. It worked before. What am I doing wrong, Tanasha? No kidding. Well, okay. If you're going to be in the trial business, but probably also if you're going to be in the research business or in the coordinating center business, rule number 1 is document. I mean, and document as you go, because you never know when you're going to need this information, and if you haven't got it written down, you're in trouble. So document. And then the second rule is verify the accuracy of your documentation. Now, therein lies a story. Teddy said, well, if you can't think of anything to say, just tell some war stories. So here's a war story. I started out, my first trial was the University Group Diabetes Program, or some people came to call it the GDUP, because they didn't like the results. And I was sitting there at the University of Minnesota, and I had to come up with the randomization scheme. Well, the only thing I knew about randomization was what I'd heard about in a couple of courses. I'd never done it before, so I said about it, and I said, well, I better write this stuff down. This is probably important. So I wrote it down and filed the document away. And lo and behold, 10 years later, there's a committee that comes to review the results, and what's the first thing they want to see? The documentation of your randomization scheme. Well, so I pulled it out, was able to find it, and gave it to them, and I couldn't understand what I'd written. It wasn't any longer in English. It sitting in the file for 10 years, it had sort of changed the arrangement of words and so on, and it was no longer in English. So I couldn't. They said, well, what does this mean? And I said, well, it means what it says. So I violated rule number 2. I wrote it, but I didn't give it to anybody to read to see if it made sense to them. If I'd have given it to somebody, they'd have probably said, well, what do you mean by this or that? So if it's important, get somebody else to check it before you file it away. And then store the documentation so it can be found at least a decade after the end of the trial. A decade, 10 years. Why that long? Well, because trouble can come any time. After a decade, the probability is reduced, but the story I just told you with regard to the UGDP, that stuff was written 10 years before it was needed, and the trial was still ongoing. So if you study the history of trials, there's litigation, there's issues that come up and so on long after the trial is over. So you got to store it so you can find it. Now, the interesting part of the story I just told you is we were able to find that document. That's no mean feat. You go try to find something you wrote 10 years ago. See if you can find it. Anyway, and in order to do that, you got to have somebody like Betty Collison, or better known, at least to me, as Watson. I call her Watson. And it's after Alexander Graham Bell's Watson, not Sherlock Holmes's Watson. That Watson was a pothead. So if you refer to her as Watson, it's Alexander Graham Bell's Watson, not Sherlock Holmes' Watson. And anyway, she actually now calls herself Watson. She signs things Watson. So if I tell you to make an appointment with Watson, I'm talking about Betty Collison. They're one and the same. But anyway, it helps to have somebody like Watson around to find things. And a second story related to finding things is in the old days when Teddy referred to it, I was working on the first quote edition of the dictionary, and you probably weren't born then, but in the old days you had Bernoullis, and they weren't these small Bernoullis, they were these big Bernoullis, and so I had the dictionary on that Bernoulli, and I was going off to Arizona that day, and I was doing a little work early in the morning, and I pulled the Bernoulli off my desk and stuck it into the slot, and it didn't go in right. Well, having been born and raised in a farm, you're taught that, don't force it, just get a bigger hammer. So I pulled it out and rammed it in again, and no, it didn't sound right. I pulled it out, and you could see the magnetic stuff crumpled up, and of course I was well backed up, hadn't backed up at all. So now I'm panicky, and I'm going off to the airport, and I call up Watson, and I tell Watson, I say, well, I remember reading on an airline magazine about somebody recovering stuff like this from magnetic material. See if you can track that down. She said, well, what airline were you on? I said, I have no idea. I don't know. I mean, I know it was in the last year. And when I got to Phoenix, I called her, and she says, well, I think I found the article. And sure enough, she'd found the article. So I get on the phone when I get back home and call them up and say, I got this problem, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah, no problem. I mean, we've recovered stuff from Challenger, and, just send us the disc and $500 up front, and you call us. So, okay. I sent off the disc and $500 and called them up in a couple of weeks, and they said, well, I mean, how are you doing? Well, he says it's crumpled, it's bent. We're working on it. And called them in another couple of weeks, and same story, it's crumpled. I said, well, how the hell did the stuff look like from Challenger? Was that in good shape, or what about that? And I said, have you tried ironing it? Anyway, she found the article, but I didn't get the stuff back. Well, okay, still on the trials business, what are the essential documents? Well, number one is the protocol, and design synopsis. I'll show you what I mean by that. Study chronology and PPM. We speak of the protocol as if somehow or other it is the equivalent of a blueprint, that it tells you exactly what goes on in a trial and so on. That is certainly not the case with regard to protocols. I mean, They're plans. They tell you what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, and give you some rationale. But, anybody who thinks a protocol gives you the exact plan for a study is just mistaken. It's just not true. Anyway, so that's the table of contents, say, for the Alzheimer's prevention trial protocol sections. And, it's what, 70 some pages of, and one of the problems, it seems to me, with regard to protocols is that if you're in a multi-center trial, technically there are as many protocols as there are centers. I mean, all centers are following the common protocol, but there are variations, and you try to minimize those variations, but they exist. And I referred to a design synopsis. An essential document in a trial is what I call a design synopsis, that tells you in abbreviated form what the objective is, what the trial is about, what the treatments are, what the outcome measure is, and patient recruitment, and so on. What do you need that for? Well, again, certainly if it's a multi-center trial, there are going to be various people at various clinics wanting to talk about the trial, present to help with regard to recruitment. So you need that document for them to talk intelligently about the trial. And the third thing I mentioned is the chronology. I regard this as sort of like a ship's log. You gotta keep track of the events in the course of the trial as they're occurring. Now, this isn't designed to be read, but it just tells you important events in the course of the trial. It tells you when the steering committee met, when drug was shipped, and a variety of things, like 4 steering committee meetings, 2 study officers meetings, and 2 TMAC meetings, 6 site visits. TMAC, Treatment Effects Monitoring Committee, or Data and Safety Monitoring Committee. And then an important document is what we call the Policy and Procedures Memoranda. Policy and Procedure Memoranda is sort of a document, memos that are distributed to all investigators in a trial that have, in effect, force a protocol. So if you're, I don't know, what's up here? Conflict of interest disclosure statement, and certification procedures. Clinics have to have certification procedures, and so on and so forth. Now, that turns out to be a fairly important document. So Policy and Procedures Memoranda. And then study CV. We believe, I think, in having CVs for studies. If people have CVs, studies need CVs. You need to keep track of things as they're occurring. So that CV, the CV for the glaucoma laser trial is probably, 50, 60 pages. What the hell's that? Tanasha says it's not a gun. That document is created basically from day one and maintained over the course of the trial. And it's an important document because if you've got issues to answer or things you need to know, that's where you go. So we believe in CVs. So, well, that's the rest of that. Anyway, so now if it makes sense to have a CV for studies, then it makes sense to have a CV for the center. Now, what's a center, by the way, in academia? What do you need to create a center here at Hopkins? Well, I've cynically said you need a brochure. You need a ribbon cutting ceremony, and at least in the old days, you needed letterhead. Now letterhead has sort of gone away. It's just this email stuff. So I don't know if you need letterhead anymore. And furthermore, you can't keep the damn stuff up to date anyway. So maybe that's progress. So the point is, with regard to center, by and large, center is not a warm and fuzzy term when it comes to funding. You can create a center, but you got to fund yourself. So funding for this center and a lot of other centers in the institution are that way. Are you, Ellen? Do you have a center?
No, we're a consortium.
Oh well, that's that. Oh, well, they're a consortium.
But we have a brochure, and we have
A website. See, I don't think the website is the replacement of the...
Yeah. Well, no. I think that's a good point. You need a website. Yeah. You need.
a ribbon cutting, didn't we?
We did not have a ribbon.
No. Well, then you're technically, well, okay, that's why you call yourself a consortium, maybe, huh? Because you really don't qualify as a center. Yeah. So, anyway, you survive by your own sweat. Now, if you're going to do a center CV, we got to decide what gets counted. Well, a trial, in this thing I've done, a trial to be counted had to have been ongoing in 1990. That's the year the center was created. Or started in 1990 or after that. 2, had to provide uninterrupted funding over the course of the trial once funded in the center. That's to sort of, there are a few trials, I think, where we've been involved and then we got uninvolved or we walked away or whatever. So they aren't counted. And they had to provide salary support for 2 or more people in the center over the course of the trial. So those were the counting rules. You know, I'm happiest if people are interrupting me and talking because then I don't have to talk as much. So, you know, come on.
Okay, so of the 20% of trials you got funded,
Yeah.
how many of them completed in the time period that you set out in the originally funding period that you were?
Every one. We're very good at estimating time. You know the answer to that. That's, you know, you're just baiting me.
I'm trying to make myself feel better as being more metric.
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the natural history of trials is to always, you know, I've got the rule of 2 that you know, divide the sample size you're going to get by 2, divide the amount of time it's going to take by 2, and the event rate is going to be half of what you figured. So I mean,
Why didn't you do that in the beginning, right?
well, because you want to get funded. Janet.
Well, I just have to say, because you bring this up, that we have this asthma consortium that I think will be there, and we've been successful in completing trials on time, and it has come back to bite us back. That we had 2 trials that completed a year ahead of time.
Yeah.
And they took the funding back. And then for the trial that we had ongoing that was behind, they sent us, put us new goals, and they extended the funding.
So we're doing a good job.
Yeah, so.
Yeah,
if
yeah,
it
you're-
doesn't go too long, it's
Yeah.
not a problem. Too short is a problem.
By the way, what does it mean to be funded for a trial? I mean, so okay, I get a notice of award and I'm funded. So the next thing I want to do is go downstairs to the first floor and look where the money is. I mean, I want to see the money sitting there. Well, the money never exists. I mean, this institution is funded by a letter of intent. So if you get funded, there's no money that flows. The money only flows after the fact. The institution bills the funding agency at whatever the agreed upon interval is, and they bill them for things already done, and they send the money. So there's never any money that sits any place. It's all virtual money. Okay.
So how have you completed those trials? When you ran out of money and you had to refer the patients, did you just do no-cost extensions by going back to the funding agency to get more money?
Well, often it seems to me, I don't have that, but almost always you're going back, you ask for more money. And if you're doing a decent job, you're likely to get it. Not always, but the funding agencies are reasonable with regard to that. And as you'll see in another slide, there's a fair number of studies here that are part of a network. Well, I think Janet refers to a network. So that's a structure in which there's several trials going on at the same time and funded through the same structure, not necessarily all by the same funding agency, but it's a network as opposed to a standalone trial, like ADAPT, the one I just referred to, is a standalone trial. It's that trial and only that trial. I mean, I think the way the land is moving, it moves more and more to network rather than standalone. There are certain advantages to network, but there are certain disadvantages also. And the problem with a standalone trial is you got to create it, you got to create the structure and get it going. And when it's over, it's over. So, yeah, Janet.
Well, the other thing about where the money, a lot of times it is a no-cost extension, because most of the money, I know people don't believe this, comes in recruiting the participants. So if you don't have the participants, you haven't spent the money.
Yeah. So there's good news, bad news. Well, over that time period, there are 38 trials that are counted. 28 have been completed, and 10 are ongoing. What do I mean by completed? Well, they produced a publication. They published, quote, primary results. That's what I mean by completed. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's no more money going for those trials, but at least from my counting point of view, if they produced a primary publication, they're, quote, completed. And trials by year, in 1990 to 94, there were 4 ongoing, the same for 95 through 99, then 7, then 12, then 14. So we've increased, it seems to me, the number of trials, working harder, but increased that number. Ellen, in your consortium, how many trials do you have? Is it one trial? How many? What is it?
Well, we have, I'd say, about 8 major studies. They're not all
Yeah.
RCTs, but a combination of RCTs and observational.
Yeah. Well, registration, clinicaltrials.gov registration. How many of those trials are registered? 37 out of 38. How many were registered before 1 July 2005? Why July 1, 2005? Well, that's when registration became a requirement by the 11 editors signing that statement that's saying that after 1 July 2005, if you want us to consider your trial for publication, it's got to be registered. Otherwise, don't bother us with it. So after the important date is after 1 July 2005, and of course all are registered. And what about websites? How many have websites? Well, 34 of the 38 have websites. The primary reason for websites are really for when the trial is ongoing is investigators. It's the way you communicate with investigators, and it's the way you send documents now. With paper having gone away, you just send you send the documents to the website or to the clinic, and that's how you communicate. So 34 of the 38 have websites. I think the 4 that didn't have a website are probably fairly old trials. And then a lot of them have a public portion where you can, if you're in Sleepy Eye and you want to look at what's going on, you can get on the website and get certain documents. There's only 4 of those websites that I've been able to find where the protocol is provided on the public portion of the website. And I'm not sure. Part of me says, well, it would be nice to have the protocol there, but then part of me also says, I don't know. I mean, the problem with protocols is they change. I mean, in ADAPT, I think we had probably 5 or 6 different versions over the course, and unless you somehow or other make certain those things get changed, they get outdated. So and I know some preach that they want the protocol. I'm ambivalent with regard to protocol on the public portion. When the trial's over, I suppose I feel differently about it. But while it's ongoing, it's complicated, but more importantly, there's only 17 of the 28 where I've been able to find the publications from the trials. I can't think of any good reason why the public portion of the website doesn't have publications listed. I can think of reasons why the protocol is not listed, but publications, that's part of the public record. Ted, do you have any comments with regard to protocol? I mean, speak up or forever hold your peace.
Well, it seems to me if it's on clinicaltrials.gov, I don't see what's the difference between making the protocol public and having clinicaltrials.gov. So you might as well put your protocol up there. It can always have amendments. Protocols do have amendments. That's entirely normal.
I don't know that the protocol is on clinicaltrials.gov.
No, but you have design elements.
Well, no, of course, but that's not. I mean, when I'm saying protocol, I'm quite specific with regard to that document that goes through IRB and it gets sent to clinics and so on. Not the stuff that you find on clinicaltrials.gov. Clinicaltrials.gov, at least to me, is probably overall a blessing, but it's quite frustrating because the precision of language, and I'm having written a dictionary, I'm fairly fussy with regard to terms. The terminology is crude, and even their definitions are sort of reverse or whatever. So it's not the end all that I think some people think it is.
Maybe we can talk about at the end. I wouldn't interrupt you about why you don't adhere to the spirit, which
Well, I'll just keep talking so we can't talk about it. We'll run out of time, okay? There are more ways than one to skin a cat. I referred to this with regard to what goes on there. Most of the trials, 37 of the 38 are multi-centered. And when I say multi-center, that means they've got 2 or more clinics in different locations. And 12 of the trials are standalone, and 22 are from networks. I think in our group, Janet as the network queen and Tanesh is the network king. I mean, a lot of... And what are those trials like with regard to bias control? Well, no surprise, 38 out of the 38 are randomized. 37 of the 38 had concealment. What I mean by concealment, what I mean by that is that there's no way that I in the clinic can figure out what the next assignment is until I get it, until it's issued for that person. That's what we mean by concealment. So I think the reason why it's 37 out of 38, one of the trials had the envelope system of randomization. So deposit the randomizations in the clinic, and they open the envelopes as they need them in the order they need them. Well, that doesn't meet the definition of concealment. And in fact, if we had more time, I think I don't know if Mark is here, could tell a few war stories about that method of concealment. The upshot was that they opened envelopes not in the order until they found the one they wanted. So that's doesn't work very well. And 22 of the 38 placebo-controlled, and 27 of the 38 masked. Now, I should say a word about masking, because people sort of always take masking as the indicator of the ultimate in bias control or whatever. Well, first of all, you can't mask everything. I mean, if you're doing a surgery study, you can't mask surgery. So masking doesn't necessarily mean a trial is good or bad. It's useful if you can do it, but the main question that you've got to be concerned with in trials is, well, is the outcome measure, however it's done, reasonably free of bias? And if I'm doing a surgery trial and I'm counting people who are alive or dead, unless I'm a scoundrel, that's a fairly reliable measure, and that's fairly robust. It doesn't need to be masked. So don't deceive yourself into believing that when you read a trial, if it's not masked, that it's not any good. You got to look at the methods and the procedures and so on to decide about goodness, not whether or not it's masked or not. And the randomization unit. Well, 34 of the 38 have person as the randomization unit. One has eye as the randomization unit. Randomize one eye to laser, the other eye to drops. One has schools as the unit, and 2 were crossover trials. And treatment groups, well, the smallest number of treatment groups you can have in a randomized trial is 2, right? Well, there's 24 of the 38 that had just 2 treatment groups, a control and a test treatment. 12 had 3, and 2 had 4. So most of the trials are just 2 treatment groups. So who got studied? Well, they all involved males and females. And this is just for completed trials, because the votes are still out with regard to not completed trials. The number randomized, almost 14,000 people. The median number enrolled, 263. So, well, in some sense, small, in other senses, large. I mean, you can't really draw a conclusion with regard to that number unless you see what the trial is about. But so the median number enrolled of those 28 trials, 263, almost the same number of males and females, 7,100 versus 6,800 in those trials. The type of trial, 29 were treatment trials. You're treating something. 4 were prevention. I referred to one, the Alzheimer's prevention trial. That was a prevention trial, seeing if you could take people who were at risk for developing Alzheimer's or at increased risk, and seeing if you can keep them from getting Alzheimer's. And then there are 7 that are others, like devices, proof of concept, I don't know. You've got some of those, Janet.
So we have CPAP trial that we're finishing up now. So that's a device.
Yeah. And then what do these trials produce? Well, over the time span, 315 publications. There were 28 completed trials, so there's 28, there's 28 completed trials, but there's actually one trial that has not, at least when I did this, yet published. I'm told that it's on the way. I forget which one it is,
I recall.
I'm sure you do.
It was a trial, it's one of the trials that we got our funding cut on, so we decided to take it entire time publishing it. No, that wasn't the only reason. It was soy genistein for treatment of asthma, and we had a problem with measuring genistein in the blood, and that took a year to resolve.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, and the reason why the number adds up to 28 is there's one trial that produced 2 primary publications. So anyway, over the years, 315 publications, 28 primary and 17 related to methods. Now, how many of those stopped early? Well, what is that? That's 7, right? 2 for harm, 1 for futility, meaning you look and you say, well, even if we go to the appointed end, there's no way we're going to come up with any difference, so let's quit. 3 for benefit, and 1 because of loss of funding.
The 315 publications, what fraction of them were published before the primary publication? Like, or did you kind of wait till the primary and then you did a lot of secondary publications, or there was a large fraction that you published before the primary?
Stay tuned. Publications before, during, and after the year of primary results. So before, now a lot of those before are going to be with, some have to do with design and methods, some have to do with other aspects of methods or whatever. And during the year when the primary results were published, there were 59 publications coming from that set of 28 trials. And after the primary results, 190. Well, that's what? That's about 2/3 of the publications come after the primary results. This is one reason why I'm quite agnostic, or quite hostile actually, with some of the deposit requirements for data, because what this means is that Most of the publications come after the results are published. And if the reason why I object to a lot of these rules with regard to depositing data and so on is that I think in the end, it doesn't serve us well because it reduces the incentive for investigators to deposit. So, okay, I've posted my stuff on clinicaltrials.gov, or I've deposited it so and so. I don't any longer really have to worry about publication. The emphasis ought to go on publication. That's where it seems to me that's our primary source of information. I have no objection to depositing data later on, but I think we make a mistake if we are sort of forcing investigators to deposit before they've finished, quote unquote, with their analysis. Now, when do they finish? You got to be careful about that because I'm sure that if I could still find some of the investigators in the UGDP, they'd still have ideas with regard to things they'd want to publish, so they're not technically finished. So you got to have some operational rule as to when investigators are finished. My rule is that they're finished when they run out of money. I mean, then it's over. I mean, they may still write papers or whatever, but certainly at that point they ought to be competing with everybody else when they run out of money. But even when they run out of money is sort of somewhat complicated because you have no cost extensions and so on. So, that's at least a decent operational rule. If you're out of money, you're out of time. I expect Teddy will have something to say about that, but she's holding her tongue. Time from start of enrollment to primary publication, 64 months. Now where did I get that from? By the way, I got that from clinicaltrials.gov. It's not, I mean, I don't know how reliable it is. It's at least a common source of information. So it's from clinicaltrials.gov. There's an entry on there as to when they start enrollment. And I can tell when the paper is published, so that's where I got those numbers from. And if we talk about how long does it take to do a trial, you're going to have to add at least 2 more years to that, or more. If I'm going to do an investigator-initiated trial, I told you it took 3 years to get ADAPT funded, so add that to that, and then it's going to take you, if you're lucky, a year before you start enrollment, and for bigger trials, it's going to probably take more than a year. So the actual time from beginning to publication is add 2 or 3 years to that number. And that, by the way, is why I encourage students, even though I'm an advocate of trials, to not do a dissertation doing a trial, because it's a kiss of death. I mean, it's much too long and it won't work. So you gotta try to train students in trials by having them do something else. It's complicated. One of the best areas of training, it seems to me, for students, but even here it's difficult, is get the student to sit in a data monitoring committee. You'll learn more about trials by being on those bodies than anything else. The trouble with that is that sponsors are skittish about allowing anybody to sit in on those things other than the designated people. And what's the time from completion? Again, I got these numbers from clinicaltrials.gov. When they finish data collection to publication, 11 months. With a range of minus 18 months. I think that's one of your studies that published, can't remember which one it is. And what are the conclusions? Well, 4 were negative, 12 were nil, and 11 were positive. Now, again, a language problem. I hate it when people talk about a negative trial. Because often when they say a negative trial, they mean nil. So if I was president, I would say that the only way you can refer to results in trials is you got to refer to them as negative, nil, or positive. don't worry, I'm not going to get to be president, so you've got nothing to worry about. But be careful of that word negative, because it has two meanings. Not in my language, it's negative, nil, or positive. So, and authorship, how were those primary results published? Well, 5 had conventional authorship, where it just named 2, 3, 4 people, and that's it. There's no other reference. I mean, you may find in the credit list or whatever what about the study or whatever, but but it's what I call conventional, or it's modified conventional. It's names of people and the name of the study in the masthead. Modified conventional. And by the way, if you're doing these things, it sometimes becomes important as to whether you use for or by or whatever. For the Fly By Night Incorporated Investigator Group, or some other word, because the trouble sometimes with having the study listed in the masthead is that some editors will want the necessary papers with regard to disclosures and so on from everybody on the list. So it's, or straight corporate. ADAPT was straight corporate. Masthead says the Alzheimer's, what the hell ever those letters stand for, prevention trial, and that's it. And you look in the credit section, you could find out who was in the ADAPT group, but the only thing in the masthead was the corporate name. And we could get into a discussion as to what you do if you're involved in a study and you're involved in a paper and the masthead says has only a corporate name. Do you list it on your CV or don't you? We could spend an hour on that. If I was involved in writing it, you bet your sweet bippy I listed on my CV. That's it. Any comments?
For young investigators, why should they come and work with you? And I just don't see how to retain young investigators when it takes 5 years. 5 years is very good, actually. But right now we do work. The data center, the data goes somewhere else. The samples go somewhere else, and it takes us 5, 6, 7 years until we come and see the data.
I agree with you. I mean, if I had my druthers, we'd have different rules by which we evaluate and promote people. But the trouble is the rule still is really publication, and that's the currency. But I agree with you that if we want to maintain a cadre of investigators into the rest of this century and beyond, you've got to have some other way of doing this. You got to have some other reward system. So
Any ideas about this reward?
Well, I mean, the rule number one, it seems to me, if you've got a young person, don't have them doing only a trial. Have them spread across, certainly at least spread across trials. Now, if you spread a person across trials, they're going to be in differing states of development, so they're going to be involved. They can be involved in publications before if you have them involved in a single trial, ADAPT, aside from one methods publication, didn't produce any publication for, I don't know, a lady. I mean, it would have been 6 or 7 years before there was the first publication. Well, if you've got a young faculty member working on that trial and that trial alone, they're doomed. You know, they're not going to have any publications, and they're going to be tossed out. So you got to diversify. They got to be involved in other things now, and funded by other things. So that's the only solution I have in this structure. So if, as I said, if you've got a person that's working on several trials, you got 14 trials ongoing now. You know, some of those are near finish, some of those are just starting, and others are in the middle, and so you can diversify.
My watch says it's 9:30, but if you're willing to stay around to answer one-on-one, that's great. So thank you very much. This is great. And, I always do.